Hi class, Mrs. Calvi here. Today we're going to be talking about comparing and ordering rational numbers using inequalities. All right, so first thing we need to talk about is inequality symbols. So we have our less than sign, we have our greater than sign, and we have our equal to sign. So those are called our inequality symbols. So if we were comparing just positive integers, and I was going to compare the number 5, and I'm going to compare that to the number 22. 5 is what compared to 22? We should know that 5 is less than 22. The alligator wants to eat the larger number. Pretty simple, right? So now let's say we had one positive number and one negative number. Well, if we had negative 15 and we were comparing that to the number 7, we should know that all negative numbers are smaller than all positive numbers. So in this case, negative 15 is going to be smaller or less than 7. Negative 15 is less than 7 because all negative numbers are going to be smaller than positive numbers. All right, so those are the simple ones. Now we want to talk about if we have two negative numbers. So let's say we were comparing negative 8 and negative 4. The one thing you have to remember is when you are comparing just negative numbers, you have to remember that the larger the negative, the smaller the value. You will hear me say that over and over again. The larger the negative, the smaller the value. So if we were to look at a number line, so we have 0 in the middle, we have our positives on the right side, we have our negative numbers on the left side. So as you, just talking negative numbers only, so on the left side of the number line, the further left you go, the smaller the value gets, all right? So the further left you go, the smaller the value gets. If you just remember this, the larger the negative, the smaller the value, it makes it so much easier. So if I were to think about that, the larger the negative, the smaller the value. So I have a negative 8 and I'm comparing that to a negative 4, right? So negative 8 compared to negative 4. Well, which is the larger negative? Negative 8 is the larger negative. So the larger the negative, the smaller the value. So then that means negative 8 is less than negative 4. So you can always think of this, the less than symbol, this little tiny point, the small point is pointing to the larger negative because we now know the larger the negative, the smaller the value. All right, so let's try to compare other numbers, let's see, or other integers, I should say. So let's say I'm comparing negative 8 and negative 23. So think of the number line. So the further left on the left side of the 0 you go, the smaller the value. Or the larger the negative, the smaller the value. So the larger the negative, the smaller the value. That tells me that negative 23 is smaller than negative 8 because negative 23 is the larger negative number. So that means it has the smaller value. The small little point wants to point to the larger negative number. All right. Okay, now let's say we were comparing decimals. Now these are both positive, so we're not dealing with negatives just yet. So we are comparing 3.5 or 3 5/10 to 4.2 or 4 2/10. So the easiest thing to do is line these up vertically. So if I take 3.5, line it up, you always line the decimals up, okay? And I'm actually going to be looking at this starting from the left side. So starting on the left. So I'm looking at my whole numbers here. So I have a whole number 3 and a whole number 4. So a whole number 3 and a whole number 4. Well, we know that 3 is less than 4. So that I don't even need to go any further. I don't even need to look at that tenths place. 3.5 is going to be less than 4.2. So here, I know that 3.5 is going to be less than 4.2, okay? So even though it's not a whole number and we have a decimal, we are following the same rules. Now, let's say we had a different decimal. Okay, so say we were comparing 25.7 to negative 13.4. So just as we said before, all negative numbers are going to be smaller than positive numbers. That is still true for decimals. So I know that negative 13.4 is going to be less than 25.7, or 25.7 is going to be greater than the negative 13.4. So when one is positive and one is negative, it's pretty simple. So now let's go to two negative numbers or two negative integers, because that's where it gets a little bit more difficult. Okay, so let's say I was comparing negative 4.5 to negative 3.5. So the larger the negative, the smaller the value. If I have a whole number as a negative 4 and a whole number as a negative 3, the larger the negative, the smaller the value. I automatically know that negative 4.5 is going to be less than negative 3.5. Because remember, on our number line, what did we say? The further left we go, so let's say I had negative 4 here, and I had negative 3 here. Negative 3.5 is going to come in between here. Negative 4.5 is going to be here. Remember, I said the further left you go on the negative side only, the smaller the value. The further away it goes, the smaller it gets. So I know that the negative 4.5 is going to be less than negative 3.5. All right, now let's say we were talking about fractions. Many students get confused about the tick marks on a number line. So if you look at what I have here, I have 0 in the middle, and I am going to the right for my positive numbers, in this case, a fraction and a whole number. So some students get confused with, how do we know what these tick marks represent? So one thing we need to know is that if we have counting the tick marks, so if I count my tick marks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. By the time I get to my 8th tick mark, that is equal to 1 whole because it's marked on my number line. So if I know I have 8 tick marks, I now know that 8/8 is equal to 1 whole, okay? When your numerator, which is my number on the top of my fraction, my numerator, and my denominator are the same number, that is going to equal 1 whole. So 8/8 is equal to 1 whole. So now I know that these tick marks are going by eighths. Well, you might be thinking, well, how is this then 1/2? Well, let's think about this. These are eighths. 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8. So 4/8 is equivalent to 1/2. These are both divisible by 4. If you were to divide the numerator and denominator by 4, it would get me to 1/2. All right? So that's how I figured out that these were going by eighths. I counted how many tick marks to get to that 1 whole. So I know that the numerator and the denominator, when they are the same number, it equals 1 whole. So let's just say I had 5/5. I know that that equals 1 whole. 3/3. That equals 1 whole. When your numerator and denominator are the same number, it equals 1 whole. All right, so you need to understand what the tick marks represent when you are looking at number lines. Now, number lines could be made up completely differently. We've talked about them going by 1s, by 2s, by 5s, by 10s. In this case, this is going to be going by fraction form. Okay, so let's say I were to actually mark up my number line here. So I'm going to make this 1/8, 2/8, 3/8. That technically is going to be 4/8, 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, and our 1 whole is 8/8. All right. So let's say I was comparing fractions. So let's say I was comparing 1/8 to 5/8. Well, when we're looking at the number line to the right of 0, The further away we go, the further right we go, the larger the value. And this is pretty easy because we have our denominators the same. If your denominators are the same in a fraction, you just look at your numerator and that's going to tell you your inequality. So I know that 1 is less than 5, so I know 1/8 is going to be less than 5/8. Now let's say I had 1/8 and this fraction over here, I made it 1/2. I'm going to make that 1/2, that fraction. So now you might say, oh, 8 1/2, the denominators are different. Now what do I do? Well, let's see. Let me just erase my answer there. In order to see less than, greater than, or equal to, comparing fractions, you can cross multiply. So I'm going to cross multiply here. 8 times 1 gives me 8. 2 times 1 gives me 2. Well, 2 is less than 8, so I know that 1/8 is less than 1/2. Okay? You can compare any two fractions in that format. So I'm going to pick two more fractions. If I had 2/3 and I wanted to compare it to 4/5, my denominators are not the same, so I cannot just look at my numerators. So I'm going to cross multiply. 3 times 4 gives me 12. 5 times 2 gives me 10. 10 is less than 12, so that tells me 2/3 is less than 4/5. Comparing fractions is super simple using cross multiplication. Okay, so now let's look at negative fractions. Okay, so I have my number line and I have my fractions. It's kind of sloppy because I couldn't write too small, but these are -1/8, -2/8, and so on. So let's say I was comparing -1/8 to -7/8. Well, my denominators are the same. I can technically still use my rule of cross multiplication, but let's take a look at our number line. So I have -1/8 is right here, and -7/8 is over here. Now earlier I said the further left on the negative number line you go, the smaller the value. Well, 7/8 is further to the left, so I know -7/8 is going to be smaller than -1/8. So -1/8 is then greater than -7/8. Now, if you didn't want to look at the number line and you wanted to cross multiply, let's see what happens. So if we do 8 times 7, and now here we're thinking negatives though, right? So 8 times 7, 56, and we're going to label that as a -56. If we look at 1 times 8, and we're looking at this as negative, is -8. The larger the negative, the smaller the value. So the larger the negative, the smaller the value. So if you notice, -7/8 is still smaller because -56 is smaller than -8. All right? Okay, another thing I want to go over is ordering your integers from least to greatest, greatest to least. So I'm going to look at these integers and I'm going to order them from least to greatest. Well, I know that negative numbers are smaller than positive. So I know I have to look at my -4 and my -3 first. Well, what do I say? The larger the negative, the smaller the value. So the larger the negative, the smaller the value. I have to go from least to greatest, -4 to -3. Now I'm just looking at the rest of my numbers and putting them in order from least to greatest as my positive numbers. Well, 0 is going to go next. Then I'm going to do a 2, an 8, and a 9. Double check how many numbers were in my original data set. You should always do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's make sure I still have 6 numbers. 1 or integers. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, it doesn't guarantee me that my answer is correct, but at least I have 6 integers, and I had 6 integers in my original set. Okay, so ordering numbers from least to greatest. Remember, negatives always come before positives. The larger the negative, the smaller the value. You would do the same thing if you were ordering decimals and fractions as well. All right, quick review on decimals. Now, I told you earlier, you should line up your decimals vertically on top of each other by decimal point. I always start with the number that has the most digits. So if you notice, this has 3 digits and this has 2 digits. So I always start with the number that has the most digits. So 1.25, and I'm going to line up 2.4 by the decimal. So I have a blank space right here. So I want to put a digit there, and I'm going to put a placeholder, which is 0. You can't put any digit, it can only be 0. So now again, I'm going to start all the way from the left when I'm comparing decimals. So I have 1 whole and 2 wholes. Well, I know that 1 is less than 2. So I don't even need to look at the rest of my digits. I already can tell which is less than and greater than. I know that 2.4 is going to be greater than 1.25. Many students tend to look and they say, oh, there are 3 digits here. This must be larger. This only has 2 digits. You cannot do that. You cannot look at how many digits they have to determine whether they are less than or greater than. Okay, so let's say I'm comparing these two. Now I have a mixed number on my left side. This -2 3/4 is called a mixed number, and I'm comparing that to -1/2. All right, so they're both negatives. So this is where you have to remember, the larger the negative, the smaller the value, okay? The larger the negative, the smaller the value. If we were to be looking at our number line, we know the further left we go on the negative side, the smaller the value. So let's say I had, these were going by ones. 1, 2, 3. So negative, and these are negatives. So -1/2 is going to come in between 0 and -1. So -1/2 would be here. And -2 3/4. So -2. So let's see. -2.5 would be like right in the middle here. So -2 3/4 would be right before my -3 mark. All right. So let's say -2 3/4 would land about here. So as I said, the further left you go on the negative side, the smaller the value. The larger the negative, the smaller the value. Well, if you think about this one has a whole number and this one doesn't. So this is a larger negative number telling us that it has to be less than the -1/2. All right, guys, that is it for today, and I will talk to you soon.